Greetings, programs. Welcome to episode 10, Abortion, which is not what I was planning on doing this week, but the lavender lady wasn't available or hasn't been able to free up any time on her schedule yet, so we won't be talking about our why conservatives really can't handle transgender people bit. Instead, I will be doing this, abortion, which is something that someone asked me to do. Now, I don't have a prepared thing about this. My stance is really simple. It's a woman's right to choose, that's it, and it's none of my damn business other than that. But I was asked, so I have here an article which I will review, which as far as I can tell pretty much lines up perfectly with what I would have written if I was a really good writer. I will include links below. This will be footnote number 1. So I'm going to read it all out. And add my 2 cents when it pops up. And we'll see how we go. So the article is by Judith Jarvis Thompson, and it's called A Defense of Abortion. And it's from Philosophy and Public Affairs, Volume 1, Number 1, Fall, that's autumn, for people who aren't American, in 1971. So it's been around for a while. But funny thing is, it really hasn't changed a lot in the last few decades or so. So here we go. Most opposition to abortion relies on the premise that the fetus is a human being, a person, from the moment of conception. The premise is argued for, but as I think, not well. Take for example the most common argument. We are asked to notice that the development of a human being from conception through birth into childhood is continuous. That it is said that to draw a line, to choose a point in this development and say, before this point the thing is not a person, and after this point it is a person, is to make an arbitrary choice. A choice for which, in the nature of things, no good reason can be given. It is concluded that the fetus is, or anyway, we had better say that it is, a person from the moment of conception. But this conclusion does not follow. Similar things might be said about the development of an acorn into an oak tree, and it does not follow that acorns are oak trees, or that we had better say that they are. Arguments of this form are sometimes called slippery slope arguments. The phrase is perhaps self-explanatory, and it is dismaying that opponents of abortion rely on them so heavily and uncritically. I am inclined to agree, however, that the prospects for drawing a line in the development of a fetus look dim. I am inclined to think also that we shall probably have to agree that the fetus has already become a human person well before birth. Indeed, it comes as a surprise when one first learns how early in its life it begins to acquire human characteristics. By the 10th week, for example, it already has a face, arms and legs, fingers and toes, it has internal organs, and brain activity is detectable. On the other hand, I think that the premise is false that the fetus is not a person from the moment of conception. A newly fertilized ovum, a newly implanted clump of cells, is no more a person than an acorn is an oak tree. But I shall not discuss any of this, for it seems to me to be of great interest to ask what happens if, for the sake of argument, we allow the premise. How precisely are we supposed to get from there to the conclusion that abortion is morally impermissible? Opponents of abortion commonly spend most of their time establishing that the fetus is a person, and hardly any time explaining the step from there to the impermissibility of abortion. Perhaps they think the step too simple and obvious to require much comment, or perhaps instead they are simply being economical in argument. Many of those who defend abortion rely on the premise that the fetus is not a person, but only a bit of tissue that will become a person at birth, and why pay out more arguments than you have? Whatever the explanation, I suggest that the step they take is neither easy nor obvious, that it calls for closer examination than is commonly given, and that when we do give this a closer examination, we shall feel inclined to reject it. And yeah, basically I agree. The arguments for abortion hold whether you grant full human rights to the fetus or not. And then once you've completed those sets of arguments, you can then point out that dude, it's not a full human being either, so you're doubly screwed. So that's my take on that. I propose then that we grant that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. How does the argument go from here? Something like this, I take it. Every person has a right to life. So the fetus has a right to know. No doubt, the mother has a right to decide what will happen in and to her body. Everybody should grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed, and abortion may not be performed. It sounds plausible. Now let me ask you to imagine this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist. A famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system is plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood, as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, "Look, we're sorry that the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it had we known. But still, they did it. And the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailments and can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to this situation? No doubt. It would be very nice of you if you did. A great kindness. But do you have to accede to it? What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years? Or longer still? What if the director of the hospital says, "Tough luck, I agree, but now you've got to stay in bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life"? Because remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. So you cannot ever be unplugged from him. I imagine you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with that plausible sounding argument I mentioned from a moment ago. And this is it. This right here is the heart of the argument, pretty much. Yes, it's a slightly silly analogy, but it's about as close as you can get to pregnancy and the fetus's need for your body to stay alive. And it pretty much exactly mirrors pregnancy. Sure, it's inconvenient and it's going to put you at some risk or hassle or pain or what have you, but hey, it's going to end sooner or later, and you'll get over the scars, sure. On with the story. In this case, of course, you were kidnapped. You didn't volunteer for the operation that plugged the violinist into your kidneys. Can those who oppose abortion on the grounds that I mentioned make an exception for a pregnancy due to rape? Certainly. They can say that persons have a right to life only if they didn't come into existence because of rape. Or they can say that all persons have a right to life, but some have less of a right to life than others. In particular, those who came into existence because of rape have less. But these statements have a rather unpleasant sound. Surely the question of whether you have a right to life at all, or how much of it you have, shouldn't turn on the question of whether or not you are a product of rape. And in fact, the people who oppose abortion on the grounds I mentioned do not make this distinction, and hence do not make an exception in the case of rape. And I have to agree. As much as it sucks to be raped, and doubly so to get pregnant, it doesn't change the baby, the potential baby, the fetus. You don't treat your friends differently just because some of them were planned pregnancies and others were accidents, as many of us are, and you don't hate on a guy just because his genetic father raped his mother. That ain't cool for reasons that are beyond obvious. So why should it matter to the fate of the fetus whether it came into existence by accident, on purpose, or as a result of rape? And to say that it's okay to abort if you don't like the circumstances of how that fetus came to be in the first place, well, that's just hypocritical in that whole right to life business. Back to the story. Nor do they make an exception for a case in which the mother has to spend 9 months of her pregnancy in bed. They would agree that it would be a great pity and hard on the mother, but all the same, all persons have a right to life. The fetus is a person, and so on. I suspect, in fact, they would not make an exception for a case in which, miraculously enough, the pregnancy went on for 9 years, or even the rest of the mother's life. She's probably right here. Some won't even make an exception for a case in which continuation of the pregnancy is likely to shorten the mother's life. They regard abortion as impermissible even to save the mother's life. Such cases nowadays are very rare, and many opponents of abortion do not accept this extreme view. All the same, it is a good place to begin. A number of points of interest come out in respect to it. And this has happened more than once. If you look it up in the news, you will find that in some places, I think Ireland a while ago, and a few other more strictly religious places, that mothers have been in distress, they've needed an abortion and been refused and then died as a result of it, even when the child was already non-viable. So don't take my word for it, please look it up. If I find any obvious cases, I'll put them in the footnotes, and they will be footnote number 2. This is section 1 of the main article. Let us call the view that abortion is impermissible even to save the mother's life the extreme view. I want to suggest first that it does not issue from the argument I mentioned earlier without the addition of some fairly powerful premises. Suppose a woman has become pregnant and now learns that she has a cardiac condition such that she will die if she carries the baby to term. What may be done for her? The fetus has a right to life, but as a mother is a person too, so has she a right to life. Presumably, they have an equal right to life. How is it supposed to come out that abortion may not be performed? If mother and child have an equal right to life, shouldn't we perhaps flip a coin? Or should we add the mother's right to life, her right to decide what happens in and to her body, which everybody seems to be ready to grant, the sum of her rights now outweighing the fetus's right to life? The most familiar argument here is the following. We are told that performing the abortion would be directly killing the child, whereas doing nothing would not be killing the mother, but only letting her die. Moreover, in killing the child, one would be killing an innocent person, for the child has committed no crime and is not aiming for his mother's death. Then there are a variety of ways in which this might be continued. 1. But as directly killing an innocent person is always and absolutely impermissible, and abortion may not be performed. Or 2. As directly killing an innocent person is murder, and murder is always and absolutely impermissible, and abortion may not be performed. Or 3. As one's duty to refrain from killing an innocent person is more stringent than one's duty to keep a person from dying, and abortion may not be performed. Or 4. If one's only options are directly killing an innocent person or letting a person die, one must prefer letting the person die, and thus an abortion may not be performed. Well, that seems pretty clear-cut, doesn't it? Some people seem to have thought that these are not further premises which must be added if the conclusion is to be reached, but that they follow from the very fact that an innocent person has the right to life. This seems to me to be a mistake, and perhaps the simplest way to show this is to bring out that while we must certainly grant that innocent persons have a right to life, in theses 1 through 4, all are false. Take 2, for example. If directly killing an innocent person is murder, and thus it is impermissible, then the mother's directly killing the innocent person inside her is murder, and thus impermissible. But it cannot seriously be thought to be murder if the mother performs an abortion on herself to save her life. It cannot seriously be said that she must refrain, and that she must sit passively by and wait for her death. Let us look again at the case of you and the violinist. There you are, in bed with the violinist, and the director of the hospital says to you, "It's all most distressing, and I deeply sympathise. But you see that this is putting an additional strain on your kidneys, and you'll be dead within a month. But you have to stay where you are all the same, because unplugging you will be directly killing an innocent violinist, and that's murder, and that's impermissible. If anything in the world is true, it is that you do not commit murder. You do not do what is impermissible. If you reach round to your back and unplug yourself from the violinist to save your life." The main focus of attention in writings on abortion has been on what a third party may or may not do in answer to a request from a woman for an abortion. That is, in a way understandable. Things being as they are, there isn't much a woman can safely do to abort herself. So the question asked is what a third party may do, and what the mother may do if it is mentioned at all, if deduced, almost as an afterthought, from what third parties may do. But it seems to me to treat the matter in this way is to refuse to grant the mother that very status of personhood which is so firmly insisted upon for the fetus. For we cannot simply read off what a person may do from what a third party may do. Suppose you find yourself trapped in a tiny house with a growing child. and I do mean a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child, you're already up against the wall of the child, and in a few minutes you'll be crushed to death. The child, on the other hand, won't be crushed to death. If nothing is done to stop him from growing, he'll be hurt, but in the end he'll simply burst open the house and walk out a free man. Now, I could well understand if a bystander were to say, "There's nothing I can do for you. We cannot choose between your life and his. We cannot be the ones to choose to decide who is to live. We cannot intervene." But it cannot be concluded that you can do nothing, that you cannot attack it to save your life. However innocent the child may be, you do not have to wait passively while it crushes you to death. Perhaps a pregnant woman is vaguely felt to have the status of a house, to which we don't allow the right of self-defense. But if the woman houses a child, it should be remembered that she is a person who houses it. And this is an important point. Sometimes people who are arguing sort of pro-forced birth have a tendency to treat women as incubators. They also tend to blame them for it as well, but that's a separate issue which we'll get to later. Back to the story. I should perhaps stop to say explicitly that I'm not claiming that people have a right to do anything whatever to save their lives. I think rather that there are drastic limits to the right of self-defense. If someone threatens you with death unless you torture someone else to death, I think you have not the right even to save your life to do so. But the case under consideration here is very different. In our case, there are only two people involved, one whose life is threatened and one who threatens it. Both are innocent. The one who is threatened is not threatened because of any fault. The one who threatens does not threaten because of any fault. For this reason, we may feel that we bystanders cannot interfere, but the threatened person can. In sum, a woman can surely defend her life against the threat to it posed by the unborn child, even if doing so involves its death. And this shows not merely that the theses in 1 through 4 are false, it also shows that the extreme view of abortion is false. So we need not canvass any other possible ways of arriving at it from the argument I mentioned at the outset. So that's the extreme view dealt with. The idea that, no, you can't do anything even if it's going to kill you. That's that part dealt with. And it's not perfect, but I have to agree. And I suspect that the view that no, you can't have an abortion even if it's going to cost you your life is probably a very rare view. Human beings being what they are, there'll be some out there. But I think most people can grasp that there's an equality here. That the baby doesn't get to have a right to life at the expense of yours. Like, you're going to die, or it's going to die, and you do get to choose, and it's not here to argue its case. Now we come into section 2, the less extreme view. The extreme view could of course be weakened to say that while abortion is permissible to save the mother's life, it may not be performed by a third party, but only by the mother herself. But this cannot be right either, for we have to keep in mind that it is the mother and the unborn child are not like two tenants in a small house, which has by some unfortunate mistake been rented to both. The mother owns the house. The fact that she does adds to the offensiveness of deducing that the mother can do nothing, from the supposition that third parties can do nothing. But it does more than this. It casts a bright light on the supposition that third parties can do nothing. Certainly it lets us see that a third party who says, "I cannot choose between you," is fooling himself if he thinks that this is impartiality. If Jones has found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, it is not impartiality that says, "I cannot choose between you," when Smith owns the coat. Women have said it again and again, "This body is my body," and they have reason to feel angry, reason to feel that it has been like shouting into the wind. Smith, after all, is hardly likely to bless us if we say to him, "Of course it's your coat, anybody would grant that it is, but no one may choose between you and Jones who is to have it." We should really ask what it is that says no one may choose in the face of the fact that the body that houses the child is the mother's body. It may simply be a failure to appreciate this fact. It may be something more interesting, namely the sense that one has a right to refuse to lay hands on people, even where it be just and fair to do so, even where justice seems to require that somebody do so. Thus, justice may call for somebody to get Smith's coat back from Jones, and yet you have a right to refuse to be the one who lays hands on Jones, a right to refuse to do physical violence to him. This, I think, must be granted. But what should be said is not no one may choose, but only I cannot choose. And indeed, not even this, but I will not act, so accepting responsibility for it, leaving it open that somebody else can or should. In particular, that anybody in a position of authority with the job of securing people's rights both can and should. So this is no difficulty. I have not been arguing that any given third party must accede to the mother's request that he perform an abortion to save her life, but only that he may. I suppose that in some views of a human's life, the mother's body is simply on loan to her, the loan not being one which gives her any prior claim to it. One who held this view might think it impartiality to say, I cannot choose, but I shall simply ignore this possibility. My own view is that if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, he has a just prior claim to his own body. Perhaps this needn't be argued for here anyway, since, as I mentioned, the arguments against abortion we are looking at do grant that the woman has a right to decide what happens in and to her body. But although they do grant it, I have tried to show that they do not take seriously what is done in granting it. I suggest that the same thing will appear even more clearly when we turn away from cases where the mother's life is at stake, and attend, as I propose we do now, to the vastly more common cases in which a woman wants an abortion for some less weighty reason than saving her own life. So now we're starting to get into the real ones. The ones where you might think only a crazy person would say, no, that's not right. Beyond the really, really simple stuff of, well, if she's going to die, then she gets to choose. This is where it starts to get tricky. This is where you actually have to think about it. Part 3. Where the mother's life is not at stake, the argument I mentioned at the outset seems to have a much stronger pull. Everyone has a right to life, so the unborn person has a right to life. And isn't the child's right to life weightier than anything other than the mother's own right to life, which she might put forward as a ground for abortion? This argument treats the right to life as if it were unproblematic. It is not. And it seems to me to be precisely the source of the mistake. For we should now, at long last, ask what it comes to have the right to life. In some views, having a right to life includes having a right to be given at least the bare minimum one needs for continued life. But suppose what is in fact is the bare minimum a man needs for continued life is something he has no right at all to be given. If I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is a touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of them to fly in from the west coast to provide it. It would be less nice, though no doubt well meant, if my friends flew out to the west coast and brought Henry Fonda back with him. Wow, this is really dating it. I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. Or again, to return to the story I told earlier, the fact that for continued life, the violinist needs the continued use of your kidneys does not establish that it is your right to be given the continued use of your kidneys. He certainly has no right against you that you should give him continued use of your kidneys. Well, nobody has any right to use your kidneys unless you give him this right. If you do allow him to go on using your kidneys, this is a kindness on your part, and not something he can claim from you as his due. Nor has he any right against anybody else that they should give him continued use of your kidneys. Certainly he has no right against the Society of Music Lovers that they should plug him into you in the first place. And now, if you start to unplug yourself, having learned that you will otherwise have to spend 9 years in bed with him, there is nobody in the world who must try to prevent you in order to see to it that he is given something he has a right to be given. Wow, that was a bit of a mouthful. You can really tell this was written in the 70s. It's a little rough. So basically, to use some common terms, it's distinguishing the difference between a moral right and a moral virtue. Like the Henry Fonda. If all you need to live is his touch, somehow, magically, it's great if he goes out of his way to give that to you. That's a moral virtue. We applaud him, we buy him a round of drinks, we take him to dinner, we give him an award. Good on good old Henry Fonda. However, you don't also have the right to demand that. You can't just kidnap him or strong-arm him or blackmail him or whatever into coming over and doing this thing. It might be great if he did it. You might even be able to give him the evils if he didn't, but you have no right to somebody else's labour, as it were. There's a loaded word. On with the story. Some people are rather stricter about the right to life. In their view, it does not include the right to be given anything, but amounts to, and only to, the right to not be killed by anybody. But here a related difficulty rises. If everybody is to refrain from killing that violinist, then everybody must refrain from doing a great many different sorts of things. Everybody must refrain from slitting his throat. Everybody must refrain from shooting him. And everybody must refrain from unplugging you from him. But does he have a right against everybody that they shall refrain from unplugging you from him? To refrain from doing this is to allow him to continue to use your kidneys. It could be argued that he has a right against us that we should allow him to continue to use your kidneys. That is, while he had no right against us that we should give him use of your kidneys, it might be argued that he anyway has a right against us that we shall not now intervene and deprive him of the use of your kidneys. I shall come back to third-party interventions later, but certainly the violinist has no right against you that you allow him to continue to use your kidneys. As I said, if you do allow him to use them, it is a kindness on your part, but not something that you owe him. So that's the long form of what I said earlier. The difficulty I point to here is not peculiar to the right to life. It reappears in connection with all sorts of other natural rights, and it is something which an adequate account of rights must deal with. For present purposes, it is enough to draw attention to it, but I would stress that I'm not arguing that people do not have a right to life. Quite the contrary. It seems to me that the primary control we must place on the acceptability of an account of rights is that it should turn out in that account to be a truth that all persons have a right to life. I am arguing only that having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the use of or a right to be allowed continued use of another person's body, even if one needs it for life itself. So the right to life will not serve the opponents of abortion in the very simple and clear way which they seem to have thought it would. So to summarize that, sure, you have a right to life, but you don't have the right to take from other people whatever you need to get it, whether that be the world famous violinist or a fetus. On to section 4. There is another way to bring out the difficulty. In the most ordinary sort of case, to deprive someone of what he has a right to is to treat him unjustly. Suppose a boy and his small brother are jointly given a box of chocolates for Christmas. If the older boy takes the box and refuses to give his brother any of the chocolates, he is unjust to him, for the brother has been given a right to half of them. But suppose that, having learned that otherwise it means 9 years in bed with that violinist, you unplug yourself from him. You are surely not being unjust to him, for you gave him no right to use your kidneys, and no one else can have given him any such right. But we have to notice that in unplugging yourself, you are killing him, and violinists, like everybody else, have a right to life, and thus in the view that we were considering just now, the right not to be killed. So here, you do what he supposedly has a right that you shall not do, but you do not act unjustly to him in doing it. The emendation which may be made at this point is this. The right to life consists not in the right not to be killed, but rather in the right to not be unjustly killed. This runs a risk of circularity, but never mind. It would enable us to square the fact that the violinist has a right to life with the fact that you do not act unjustly towards him in unplugging yourself, thereby killing him. For if you do not kill him unjustly, you do not violate his right to life. And so it is no wonder you do him no injustice. If this emendation is accepted, the gap in the argument against abortion stares us plainly in the face. It is by no means enough to show that the fetus is a person, and to remind us that all persons have the right to life. We need to be shown also that killing the fetus violates its right to life, that abortion is unjust killing. And is it? And given that these sorts of arguments are usually the ones put forth by conservatives in the US, aka Republicans, this is where it starts to look bad for them, because as a stereotype, and I realize this doesn't include everybody, but it does fit the bill for the majority of them. But as a stereotype, your average Republican is anti-abortion, often for claimed religious reasons, but pro-guns, which lead to death, and pro-execution. Back to the story. I suppose we may take it as a datum that in the case of pregnancy due to rape, the mother has not given the unborn person a right to use of her body for food and shelter. Indeed, in what pregnancy could it be supposed that the mother has given the unborn person such a right? It is not as if there are unborn persons drifting about the world to whom a woman says, "I invite you in." But it might be argued that there are other ways that one can have acquired the right to use of another person's body than by having been invited to use it by that person. Suppose a woman voluntarily indulges in intercourse, knowing of the chance that it will issue in pregnancy, and then she does become pregnant. Is she not in part responsible for the presence, in fact the very existence of the unborn person inside? No doubt she did not invite it in. But doesn't her partial responsibility for its being there give it a right to the use of her body? If so, then her aborting it will be like the boys taking away the chocolates, and less like you're unplugging yourself from the violinist. Doing so would be depriving it of what it does have a right to, and thus would be doing it an injustice. And then too, it might be asked whether or not she can kill it, even to save her own life. If she voluntarily called it into existence, how can she now kill it, even in self-defense? The first thing to be said about this is that it is something new. Opponents of abortion have been so concerned to make out the independence of the fetus, in order to establish its right to life, just as its mother does, that they have tended to overlook the possible support they might gain from making out that the fetus is dependent on the mother in order to establish that she has a special kind of responsibility for it. A responsibility that gives it rights against her which are not possessed by any independent person, such as an ailing violinist who is a stranger to her. On the other hand, this argument would give the unborn person a right to its mother's body only if her pregnancy resulted from a voluntary act, undertaken in full knowledge of the chance that a pregnancy might result from it. It would leave out entirely the unborn person whose existence is due to rape. Pending the availability of some further argument then, we will be left with the conclusion that unborn persons whose existence is due to rape have no right to the use of their mother's body, and thus that aborting them is not depriving them of anything they have a right to, and hence is not an unjust killing. We should also notice that it is not at all plain that this argument really does go even as far as it purports to. There are cases and cases, and the details make a difference. If the room is stuffy and I therefore open a window to air it and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She has given him the right to use of her house, for she is at least partly responsible for his presence there, having voluntarily done what enabled him to get in full knowledge that there are such things as burglars and that burglars burgle. It would be still more absurd to say this if I had bars installed outside my windows, precisely to prevent burglars getting in, and a burglar got in only because of a defect in the bars. It remains equally absurd if we imagine that it is not a burglar who climbs in, but an innocent person who blunders or falls in. Again, suppose it were like this. People's seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpet or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens and do the best you can buy. As it can happen, however, on very rare occasions does happen, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and take root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to the use of your house? Surely not, despite the fact you voluntarily opened your windows. You knowingly kept carpets and upholstered furniture, and you knew that screens were sometimes defective. Someone may argue that you're responsible for its rooting, that it does have a right to your house, because after all, you could have lived out your life with bare floors and furniture, or with sealed windows and doors. But this won't do, for by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy, or by never leaving home without a reliable army. And this slightly crazy looking example does sort of neatly highlight that whole, well, you shouldn't have had sex if you didn't want a baby, which a lot of people use as an argument because it's like you're volunteering for it, as it were, ignoring the whole fact that sex is such a fundamental drive for humans that people will risk death in order to get it. Yeah, people are that stupid. It seems to me the argument we are looking at can establish at most there are some cases in which the unborn person has the right to the use of its mother's body, and therefore some cases in which abortion is unjust killing. There's a room for such discussion and argument as to precisely which, if any, but I think we should sidestep this issue and leave it open, for at any rate the argument certainly does not establish that all abortion is unjust killing. Section 5. There is room for yet another argument here, however. We surely must all grant that there may be cases in which it would be morally indecent to detach a person from your body at the cost of their life. Suppose you learn that the violinist needs not 9 years of life, but only 1 hour. All you need do to save his life is to spend 1 hour in bed with him. Suppose also that letting him use your kidneys for that 1 hour would not affect your health in the slightest. Admittedly, you were kidnapped. Admittedly, you did not give anyone permission to plug him into you. Nevertheless, it seems to me plain that you ought to allow him use of your kidneys for that hour. It would be indecent to refuse. Suppose pregnancy only lasted an hour and constituted no threat to life or health. Suppose that a woman becomes pregnant as a result of rape. Admittedly, she did not voluntarily do anything to bring about the existence of a child. Admittedly, she did nothing at all which could give the unborn person a right to use of her body. All the same, it might well be said, as in the newly amended violinist story, that she ought to allow it to remain for that hour, and that it would be indecent of her to refuse. Now, some people are inclined to use the term right in such a way that it follows from the fact that you ought to allow a person to use your body for the hour he needs. That he has the right to use your body for the hour that he needs, even though he has not been given that right by any person or act. They may say that it follows also that if you refuse, you act unjustly towards him. This use of the term is perhaps so common that it cannot be called wrong. Nevertheless, it seems to me to be an unfortunate loosening of what we had better keep a tight rein on. Suppose that box of chocolates I mentioned earlier had not been given to both boys jointly, but only given to the older boy. There he sits, solidly eating his way through the box, his small brother watching enviously. Here we are likely to say, "You ought not be so mean. You ought to give your brother some of those chocolates." My own view is that it just does not follow from the truth of this that the brother has any right to any of the chocolates. If the boy refuses to give his brother any, he is greedy, stingy, and callous, but not unjust. I suppose that the people I have in mind will say it does not follow that the brother has a right to some of the chocolates, and thus the boy does not act unjustly if he refuses to give his brother any. But the effect of saying this is to obscure what we should keep distinct, namely the difference between the boy's refusal in this case and the boy's refusal in the other case, in which the box was given to both boys jointly, in which the small brother thus had, what from any point of view would be a clear title to half of it. So this is basically a restatement of the moral virtue versus moral right argument. A further objection to so using the term right, from the fact that A ought to do a thing for B, it follows that B has a right against A that A do that for him. It's going to make the question of whether or not man has a right to a thing turn on how easy it is to provide him with it. This seems not merely unfortunate but morally unacceptable. Take the case of Henry Fonda again. Here we are again. I said earlier that I had no right to the touch of his cool hand on my fevered brow, even though I needed it to save my life. I said that it would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the west coast to provide me with it, but that I had no right against him that he should do so. But suppose he isn't on the west coast. Suppose he only has to walk across the room, place a hand briefly on my brow, and lo, my life is saved. Then surely he ought to do it. It would be indecent to refuse, it is to be said. Ah well, it follows that in this case he has a right to the touch of his hand on her brow, and so it would be an injustice in him to refuse it, so that I have the right to it when it is easy for him to provide it, though no right when it is hard? It's a rather shocking idea that anybody's rights should fade away and disappear as it gets harder and harder to accord them to him. So my own view is that even though you ought let the violinist use your kidneys for the 1 hour he needs at no cost to yourself, we should not conclude that he has a right to do so. We should say that if you refuse, you are, like the boy who owns all the chocolates and will give none away, self-centered and callous, indecent in fact, but not actually unjust. And similarly, that even supposing a case in which a woman pregnant due to rape ought to allow the unborn person to use the body for the hour he needs, we should not conclude that the unborn person has a right to do so. We should say that she is self-centered, callous, indecent, but not unjust if she refuses. The complaints are no less grave, they are just different. However, there is no need to insist on this point. If anybody does wish to deduce he has a right from you ought, then all the same you must surely grant that there are cases in which it is not morally required of you that you allow the violinist to use your kidneys, in which he does not have the right to use them, and in which you do not do him an injustice if you refuse. And so for mother and unborn child. Except in such cases as the unborn person has a right to demand it, and we are leaving open the possibility that there may be such cases. Nobody is morally required to make large sacrifices of health, of all other interests and concerns, of all other duties and commitments for 9 years, or even 9 months, in order to keep another person alive. So basically this is expanding on the difference between moral virtues and moral responsibilities. Part 6. We have in fact to distinguish between two kinds of Samaritan, the Good Samaritan and what we might call the minimally decent Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan, you will remember, goes like this. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed him by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Luke 10:30-35. The Good Samaritan went out of his way, at some cost to himself, to help one in need of it. We are not told what the options were, that is, whether or not the priest and the Levite could have helped by doing less than the Good Samaritan did, but assuming that they could have, when in fact they did nothing at all, shows they were not even minimally decent Samaritans. Not because they were not actual Samaritans, but because they were not even minimally decent. These things are a matter of degree, of course, but there is a difference, and it comes out perhaps most clearly in the story of Kitty Genovese, who, as you will remember, was murdered while 38 people watched or listened, and did nothing at all to help her. A Good Samaritan would have rushed out to give direct assistance against the murderer, or perhaps we had better allow that it would have been a splendid Samaritan who did this, on the grounds that it would have involved a risk of death for himself. But the 38 not only did not do this, they did not even trouble to pick up the phone to call the police. Minimally decent Samaritanism would call for doing at least that, and their not having done it was monstrous. I should add something here about this Kitty Genovese thing. It happened, although it wasn't quite as bad in terms of everybody stood around watching and did nothing as some people have made out. It was a classic example of the bystander effect and is used as an example for it, but it wasn't quite as cut and dried as 38 people stood around and saw nothing. It was more of a case of there were some people who were aware that something was going on, and most of them left it to somebody else to deal with, but nobody was really 100% sure what was going on, other than there was a lot of noise and violence perhaps. After telling the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus said, Go, and do thou likewise. Perhaps he meant that we are morally required to act as the Good Samaritan did. Perhaps he was urging people to do more than is morally required of them. At all events, it seems plain that it was not required of any of the 38 that they rush out and give direct assistance at the risk of their own lives. That it is not morally required of anyone that he give long stretches of his life, 9 years or 9 months, to sustaining the life of a person who has no special right to demand it. We are leaving open the possibility of this. Indeed, with one striking class of exceptions, no one in any country in the world is legally required to do anywhere near as much as this for anybody else. The one class of exceptions is obvious. My main concern here is not the state of the law in respect to abortion, but it is worth drawing attention to the fact that no state in this country is any man compelled by law to be even a minimally decent Samaritan to any person. There is no law under which charges could be brought against the 38 who stood by while Kitty Genovese died. By contrast, in most states in this country, women are compelled by law to not be merely minimally decent Samaritans, but good Samaritans to unborn persons inside them. This doesn't by itself sell anything one way or another, because it may well be argued that there should be laws in this country, as there are in many European countries, compelling at least minimally decent Samaritanism. But it does show that there is a gross injustice in the existing state of the law, It also shows that the groups currently working against liberalization of abortion laws, in fact working towards having it declared unconstitutional for a state to permit abortion, had better start working for the adoption of Good Samaritan laws generally, or earn the charge that they are acting in bad faith. I should point out that this article is written in the 70s and comes from the point of view of somebody living in the US. Individual laws may have changed in the US since then, and if you're not in the US, well, obviously the laws where you live may be slightly different. Back to the article. I should think myself that minimally decent Samaritan laws would be one thing, Good Samaritan laws quite another, and in fact highly improper. But we are not here concerned with the law. What we should ask is not whether anybody should be compelled by law to be a Good Samaritan, but whether we must accede to the situation in which somebody is being compelled, by nature perhaps, to be a Good Samaritan. We have, in other words, to look now at third-party interventions. I have been arguing that no person is morally required to make large sacrifices to sustain the life of another who has no right to demand them, and this even where the sacrifices do not include life itself. We are not morally required to be Good Samaritans, or in any way very Good Samaritans to one another. But what if a man cannot extricate himself from such a situation? What if he appeals to us to extricate him? It seems to me plain that there are cases in which we can, cases in which Good Samaritans would extricate him. There you are. You were kidnapped, and 9 years in bed with that violinist lie ahead of you. You have your own life to lead. You are sorry, but you simply cannot see giving up so much of your life to sustaining of his. You cannot extricate yourself, and you ask us to do so. I should have thought that, in light of this having no right to the use of your body, it was obvious that we do not have to accede to your being forced to give up so much. We can do what you ask. There is no injustice to the violinist in doing so. So basically saying that legally and morally, it's great if you step in and help out, but as much as we may not like the fact that you can walk away, you can. Legally and morally. And that this doesn't change when the person in question is a fetus and the host in question is the potential mother. One rule for all. Violinists are men, fetuses are women. Section 7. Following the lead of the opponents of abortion, I have throughout been speaking of the fetus merely as a person, and what I've been asking is whether or not the argument we began with, which proceeds only from the fetus as being a person, really does establish its conclusion. I have argued that it does not. But of course there are arguments and there are arguments, and it may be said that I've simply fastened on the wrong one. It may be said that it is important not merely the fact that the fetus is a person, but that it is a person for whom the woman has a special kind of responsibility issuing from the fact that she is its mother. And it might be argued that any analogies are therefore irrelevant, for you do not have that special kind of responsibility for the violinist. Henry Fonda does not have that special kind of responsibility for me, and our attention might be drawn to the fact that men and women both are compelled by law to provide support for their children. I have dealt briefly with this argument in section 4 above, but a still briefer recapitulation may now be in order. Surely we do not have any such special responsibility for a person unless we have assumed it, explicitly or implicitly. If a set of parents do not try to prevent pregnancy and do not obtain an abortion, but rather take it home with them, they have then assumed responsibility for it. They have given it rights, and they cannot now withdraw support from it at the cost of its life, because they now find it difficult to go on providing for it. But if they have taken all reasonable precautions against having a child, they do not simply by virtue of their biological relationship to the child who then comes into existence, have a special responsibility for it. They may wish to assume responsibility for it, or they may not wish to do so. And I am suggesting that if assuming responsibility for it would require large sacrifices, then they may refuse. A good Samaritan would not refuse, or anyway a splendid Samaritan, if the sacrifices that had to be made were enormous. But then so would a good Samaritan assume responsibility for that violinist. So would Henry Fonda, if he is a good Samaritan, fly from the West Coast and assume responsibility for me. So parents can give kids up for adoption, and that may not be great, and the kids may not like it, and you may not like it if, say, your family members do this, but they have that right. And that law, we all recognize that it may not be great, but it is moral, it is legal. If you can't give that child what it needs, if you're not in a situation where you can properly be a parent to a child, then the moral thing, the good thing, is to give that child up to the foster system in the hopes that it can find a good foster family that can give the child the life that it needs. And failing to do so, I would argue, is immoral. Same sort of thing here. If you can't look after the child, if it would wreck your life and not give the child or potential child a good life, then no life is better than a bad one. And also, you have your own life. You have your own freedoms and rights to life of your own. Something that your stereotypical Republican often overlooks. Section 8. My argument will be found unsatisfactory on 2 counts by many of those who want to regard abortion as morally permissible. First, while I do not argue that abortion is not impermissible, I do not argue that it is always permissible. There may well be cases in which carrying the child to terms requires only minimally decent Samaritanism of the mother, and this is a standard we must not fall below. I'm inclined to think it a merit of my account precisely that it does not give a general yes or a general no. It allows for and supports our sense, for example, that a sick and desperately frightened 14-year-old schoolgirl pregnant due to rape may of course choose abortion, and that any law that rules this out is an insane law. It also allows for and supports our sense that in other cases, resort to abortion is even positively indecent. It would be indecent in the woman to request an abortion and indecent in a doctor to perform it if she is in her 7th month, and wants the abortion just to avoid the nuisance of postponing a trip abroad. The very fact that the arguments I have made have been drawing attention to treat all cases of abortion, or even all cases of abortion in which the mother's life is not at stake, as morally on a par, ought to have made them suspect at the outset. And this is possibly where I diverge from the author here. In my particular stance is we don't get to say yay or nay to the mother's right just because we happen to disagree with her as to where the line for responsibility lies. We might be more sympathetic to the 14-year-old child who wants an abortion because this is a horrible, horrible thing that happened to her and it's going to destroy her life. And we might not be sympathetic to the woman who just finds it incredibly inconvenient to be pregnant at this time and just wants it gone away with. But we're not talking about how much we like it. We're talking about whether the mother has a right to do it or not. And even if we might not like it or agree or think it sucks, if you give the right to one, then I'd argue that you have to give the right to the other, even if you don't like it very much. Anyway, back to the article. Second, while I'm arguing for the permissibility of abortion in some cases, I am not arguing for the right to secure the death of the unborn child. It is easy to confuse these two things in that up until a certain point in the life of the fetus, it is not able to survive outside the mother's body. Hence, removing it from her body guarantees its death. But they are importantly different. I have argued that you're not morally required to spend 9 months in bed sustaining the life of that violinist. But to say this is by no means to say that if when you unplug yourself there is some unexpected miracle and he survives, you then have the right to turn around and slit his throat. You may detach yourself even if this costs him his life. You have no right to be guaranteed his death by some other means, if unplugging yourself does not kill him. There are some people who feel dissatisfied by this feature of my argument. A woman may be utterly devastated by the thought of a child, a bit of herself put out for adoption and never seen of or heard of again. She may therefore not want merely that the child be detached from her, but more that it die. Some opponents of abortion are inclined to regard this as beneath contempt, thereby showing insensitivity to what is surely a powerful source of despair. All the same, I agree that the desire for the child's death is not one which anybody may gratify, should it turn out to be possible to detach the child alive. At this place, however, it should be remembered that we have only been pretending throughout that the fetus is a human being from the very moment of conception. A very early abortion is surely not the killing of a person, and so is not dealt with by anything I have said here. So, lots of case examples there, but to summarize, one person, a whole, fully human person, does not have the right to life at somebody else's expense. If that person chooses to put in the expense and effort and risk, and there is risk even in the modern world, then good for them. That's a moral virtue, but it's not a moral responsibility. And we can tell that it's not that, because if it were, no one would ever be able to give up their child for adoption. Plus, it's the same thing. You have a responsibility to the child, you cannot give it up. But in the case of adoption, we are looking at the potential life of the child. Adoption may not be great, but it's better that the child have an option to have a good life rather than the potential for staying in a shitty situation and having a shitty life. And the same goes for an abortion. Basically, bodily autonomy trumps everything. The argument I often use myself in this case is, if you disagree that bodily autonomy trumps everything else, then I am coming for your kidney because I need a new kidney and you happen to be a tissue match. If you disagree and say that I have no right to save my life at the expense of your scarring and pain, then the fetus doesn't have a right to life at the mother's expense of 9 months of effort and scarring and pain, and in some cases death. It does happen. And if you disagree and think that the mother must provide that support to the child, then I'm coming for your kidney. It's one rule for all. It doesn't change just because the target happens to be a woman. And so while it may be a moral virtue, a good Samaritan, to extend that effort, to extend that labor, it's not a moral responsibility. It's not required of you. It might be great if you did, but if you choose not to, that's your choice. So that's my position on abortion, and an article that goes into it in great and exhaustive detail. The link I have given links directly to the article, which is an optical character recognition scan of it, so you'll find a few odd words. But there's also a link to a copy of the original document, which printed in the 70s, go figure, it ain't online. Although it is now, but it's just a scan. And remember, all of this is assuming automatically already that the fetus, the blob of cells, anywhere from 1 to 1 million, is a human being with all the rights granted of a human being. Objections to this say, oh, that's a silly analogy. But the whole point of analogy is that it highlights the situation you're in a way that is different enough for you to see the problem. And while the technology does not currently exist, I don't think, for you to do the whole violinist thing, the argument is still valid. If you are not required to support the violinist, then the mother is not required to support the fetus. At some point in the future, termination of a pregnancy will involve the safe removal of that fetus, in which case it will be put into either a surrogate or an artificial womb or some other cool sci-fi thing. In which case, great, we get the best of both worlds. The fetus gets to live, the mother does not have to sacrifice herself for something that she doesn't want. Best of both possible worlds. And then that potential child can grow and become an actual child, and then can be looked after by something like the foster system. Hooray! But we don't have that technology yet. And unfortunately, the termination of a pregnancy also involves the death of the fetus, the potential child. And that's sad. This is why nobody is pro-abortion. We're pro-choice. The countervailing approach is not pro-life. It's pro-forced birth. It's pro a form of slavery, to be honest. Because you're compelling labor, pain, risk, potential death out of a person. That pretty closely fits the definition of slavery. And that's another reason I'm against it. So that's my view. That's my opinion. That's my stance. Gone over it in exhaustive detail. I generally agree with almost all of the parts of the article. Thanks to Judith Jarvis for articulating it so well. And I found the article to be very interesting and had not realized until I actually started to narrate it the subtle differences that 40 odd or more years of linguistic development had made to how things are written. Though some of it can be laid at the feet of it not being a perfect scan. Tune in next week for episode 11, which at this stage I'm not sure what it's going to be, but if somebody wants to make another request, I'm happy to fill in. I do have things on my tab, one of which is the ideally upcoming talk with Diana about why conservatives don't like trans people, which is a follow-on of my previous talk about why conservatives don't like head rushes. It's basically the same thing expanded out. Ideally, I'll be talking with her about it because she is a trans person, whereas I am not. And I think it will be somewhat disingenuous of me to talk about trans issues while not being a trans person. I am allowed an opinion like anybody else, but I think I should get somebody's viewpoint, somebody who actually lives the life. That way they can correct me if I make any horrible mistakes or stupid assumptions. And if I can't swing that with Diana, I will probably be talking on another subject so as not to ruin a perfectly good opportunity for a collaboration. Bye for now.